December 10th, 1541. As the first pale light of dawn touched the frost-bitten streets of London, something extraordinary stirred the city awake. Not church bells, not royal fanfare, but a crowd thousands thick swarming toward Tyburn like a flood of insects drawn to blood. The merchants had shuttered their shops. Nobles had rented window balconies. Even foreign ambassadors jostled for position. Why? Because they had heard the whispers that today they would witness not just an execution, but a masterpiece of royal vengeance. A punishment so brutal, so indecent, so calculated to destroy a man's body and soul, it would be remembered for centuries. This wasn't the quiet sword stroke of a noble traitor. This was theater, a horror show designed by a tyrant king to humiliate his enemy in public peace by bloody peace. The condemned man, not a murderer, not a foreign spy, but a 26-year-old nobleman named Francis Dereham, whose only crime was falling in love with the wrong woman at the wrong time, a girl who would one day become Queen of England. He had once kissed her in secret gardens, called her my wife, in letters scented with youth and dreams. Now he was tied to a wooden hurdle dragged through mud and filth by horses as London spat on him. And that was just the beginning. This story isn't just about a death. It's about how love becomes treason, how power becomes paranoia, and how one man's body was turned into a warning sign for the entire kingdom. What happened to Francis Dereham on that icy morning wasn't justice. It was performance crafted to feed the rage of a king who had been humiliated as a husband and whose pride demanded blood. What you're about to hear isn't just one of the most gruesome executions in English history. It's a descent into the darkest chambers of royal cruelty, where betrayal isn't always what it seems, and punishment is designed not to correct but to erase. Stay with me, because once you know how this ends, you'll never look at the Tudors the same way again. They say forbidden love makes the heart beat louder, and for Francis Dereham, it made his beat its last. 5 years before he was dragged through the streets of London like a butcher's carcass, Francis was just a young nobleman with charm, ambition, and a fatal weakness. He fell in love with a girl who would become queen. But this wasn't a royal courtship. There were no trumpets or blessings, only whispers in candlelight, secret letters, and stolen touches behind locked doors. The girl's name was Catherine Howard. She was barely 15, dazzling and untouchable, the niece of the powerful Duke of Norfolk. Golden-haired, green-eyed, and glowing with aristocratic promise, she had the kind of beauty that made men reckless. And Francis, 5 years her senior, was already caught in her orbit. They met not in palaces, but in the shadows of the Duke's household, where Catherine had been sent for her education, a word that sounded noble, but in practice meant she was mostly ignored and unsupervised. In that vacuum of discipline, desire bloomed. Francis was tall, smooth-tongued, and handsome, with just enough noble blood to be dangerous. Their flirtation turned into something far more serious, far more scandalous. Over 2 years, from 1536 to 1538, they exchanged gifts, shared beds, and pledged themselves to each other as husband and wife, not by law, but by love. In private letters, Catherine called him my dear husband, and Francis, like many young men intoxicated by both passion and proximity to power, believed he had claimed something eternal. But here's the catch: in Tudor England, a woman's past wasn't just personal, it was political. A queen's virginity wasn't a suggestion. It was currency, a sacred requirement that determined the legitimacy of heirs and the stability of the entire crown. And Francis Dereham, in loving Catherine before she reached the palace gates, had unknowingly lit a fuse that would one day blow them both apart. Their love was not just reckless, it was suicidal. In the eyes of history, they were fools. But in the eyes of youth, they were simply two souls who believed that love was stronger than royalty, stronger than fear, stronger than the throne. They were wrong, and the price of that mistake would be written not in ink, but in blood. History often crowns queens with gold, but for Catherine Howard, her crown was made of glass, glittering and fragile, doomed to shatter with a single whisper. In 1539, fate handed her an invitation to power she could never refuse. Still barely out of girlhood, Catherine was summoned to court as a lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves, the German princess reluctantly wed to King Henry VIII. But while Anne's stiff manners and foreign ways failed to please the aging monarch, Catherine's very presence ignited a wildfire. She didn't walk into the palace, she dazzled into it, and within weeks the king's disinterest in Anne turned into obsession with Catherine. It wasn't hard to see why. Catherine was everything Anne was not: young, flirtatious, English-bred, and radiating a kind of soft sensuality that no royal Tudor could manufacture. To Henry, now nearing 50 and bloated with both power and paranoia, she was a second chance at youth, a living antidote to the ghosts of wives past. And to the court, she was the glittering symbol of royal rebirth. Catherine didn't just rise, she ascended like a myth, going from obscure noblewoman to Queen of England in a matter of months. The transformation was so sudden, so meteoric, that it stunned even her closest confidants. One year she was sneaking kisses in the Howard Gardens, the next she wore the Tudor rose upon her chest. But while the world cheered her rise, one man watched with a mixture of awe, heartbreak, and something far darker. Francis Dereham, the man who had once held her in his arms and believed himself her husband in all but name, now stood helpless as she was claimed by the most powerful man in England. He believed, perhaps foolishly, that some part of her still belonged to him, that the vows whispered in private would mean something in public. But what Francis didn't understand, and what Catherine was now painfully learning, was that queenship in Henry's England came at a cost. It demanded not just loyalty, but erasure. Every kiss, every secret, every boy from her past had to vanish. Because in a court built on lies and spectacle, a queen wasn't allowed to have a history, only a performance. And Catherine. She was now center stage, playing a role that could make her immortal or destroy everyone who ever knew her. Every tragic story has a turning point, a single moment when fate tightens its grip, and there's no going back. For Francis Dereham, that moment came when he made the fatal mistake of re-entering Catherine Howard's life. Not as a memory, but as a man who still believed he had a claim. She was now Queen of England, draped in silks weighed down by jewels and surrounded by the ruthless machinery of royal surveillance. But to Francis, she was still the girl he had once held in the garden shadows, the girl who called him husband. And like many young men poisoned by hope, he mistook the past for power. He didn't just approach her quietly. He confronted her publicly, boldly, like someone who thought love could outrank a crown. It was a disastrous miscalculation. Catherine's queenship was built on a single trembling lie: that she had come to Henry's bed untouched, pure, unmarred by any man before him. In Tudor England, virginity wasn't virtue, it was royal currency, the very foundation of legitimacy. And Francis, by daring to speak of their past, didn't just risk her reputation. He threatened the stability of the monarchy itself. Catherine, terrified and cornered, tried to keep him quiet. The only way she could, she offered him a position in her household. He became her personal secretary, a gesture that, to outsiders, seemed like royal favor, but to Francis felt like validation. He interpreted it as acknowledgement of their past, perhaps even a secret promise of future recognition. But in the court of Henry VIII, perception kills faster than swords. Every word, every glance, every presence in the Queen's private chambers was watched, whispered about, and weaponized. Francis's boldness didn't go unnoticed. And worse, he didn't stop. He pushed harder, expecting more, blind to the trap tightening around them both. He had wandered into the most dangerous place in England, armed only with memory and pride, while Catherine was clinging to a throne balanced on denial. What he saw as love, the world saw as blackmail. What he thought was romantic bravery, the court interpreted as treason. And while Francis believed he was reclaiming what once was his, he had already become a walking death sentence. In Henry's palace, there are no second chances, only silent corridors where secrets turn into nooses. In a court built on secrets and sharpened by betrayal, rumors weren't just gossip, they were death warrants waiting to be signed. And in the autumn of 1541, the whispers around Queen Catherine Howard turned into roars. It started small, just a quiet murmur from Henry Mannix, Catherine's former music tutor, who let slip that the Queen may not have been as untouched as she claimed. But in the palace of Henry VIII, even the faintest doubt could summon catastrophe. The king, already haunted by the ghosts of Anne Boleyn and the humiliation of failed marriages, felt the familiar chill of betrayal creeping in again. And this time, he would not be made a fool. Henry ordered a full-scale investigation, and what unfolded was nothing short of a royal inquisition. Spies were unleashed, letters uncovered, servants interrogated, and every corner of Catherine's past ripped open. What they found was worse than Henry feared. It wasn't just youthful indiscretions hidden in her history. It was an ongoing pattern of secret meetings and male visitors, even after she had become queen. At the top of the list, Francis Dereham, the man who had once called her wife, the man now working in her chambers, the man who in the king's eyes had defiled the sanctity of the crown itself. The betrayal cut deeper, because it came wrapped in intimacy. There were love letters signed with pet names, eyewitness accounts of passionate embraces behind locked doors, gifts, tokens, and every trace of a love once thought innocent, now twisted into evidence of high treason. But worse still, Henry didn't just see a foolish girl who lied. He saw a conspiracy, and at the heart of it, Francis Dereham, the man who had dared to reinsert himself into the Queen's life and whisper of their past. To the king, this was no longer about jealousy. It was war, a war for control, image, and masculine pride. Francis wasn't just a former lover, he was now painted as a blackmailer, a manipulator, a man who used intimate knowledge to leverage power over the Queen. And in Henry's world, there was no greater sin than making a king feel small. The net had been cast, the betrayal was official, and Francis, whether guilty or not, had already lost. Because in Tudor England, once suspicion enters the throne room, it never leaves without dragging someone to the gallows. There are few things more dangerous in history than a humiliated king, and Henry VIII, betrayed once more by love, became a force of unchecked destruction. When the investigation into Queen Catherine Howard's past confirmed her intimate relationship with Francis Dereham, something inside Henry didn't just break, it exploded. This wasn't merely a scandal. It was a direct assault on his manhood, his authority, his very identity as king. He had survived Anne Boleyn's betrayal, endured the mockery of a loveless marriage to Anne of Cleves, and now, the radiant girl who had rekindled his pride had turned out to be a lie too. But what enraged him most wasn't Catherine. It was Francis, the man who dared to touch what the king now called his own. To Henry, this was treason in its most intimate form. Dereham hadn't raised an army or plotted assassination. His weapon was far more dangerous memory, the memory of Catherine before the crown, the memory of a body the king thought was his alone. In a court obsessed with legacy and bloodline, this wasn't just adultery. It was a direct threat to the legitimacy of royal heirs, to the sacred image of the monarchy. And Francis, he wasn't just a former lover now. He was recast as something far worse, a saboteur of royal dignity. What sealed Francis's doom wasn't the love letters, the confessions, or the gifts. It was Henry's belief that Dereham had used that past to manipulate the present, that he had walked into court not out of loyalty or regret, but to blackmail the Queen, to demand access and privilege in exchange for silence. Whether or not that was true didn't matter. In Henry's eyes, perception was guilt enough. The man had made him feel vulnerable, and no king, least of all one like Henry, could tolerate that. So the charge wasn't adultery, it was high treason, a calculated insult to the crown, deserving not just death, but disgrace. And Henry, no longer content with simple executions, wanted a punishment that would match his fury, something public, humiliating, and unforgettable. Francis Dereham was no longer a man. He was now a symbol, a cautionary tale, a living target for the wrath of a king who would rather see blood than tolerate shame. There was never any doubt about the verdict, only how cruelly it would be delivered. Once King Henry VIII had made up his mind, the so-called trial of Francis Dereham became little more than a scripted performance, with the outcome carved in stone long before the accused ever saw the courtroom. It wasn't about justice, it was about theatrical vengeance, and the audience was the entire kingdom. Francis wasn't walking into a legal proceeding. He was being fed to a ritual, one meant to cleanse the throne of shame by publicly destroying the man who had dared to taint it. He was charged with high treason, but not the kind involving spies or swords. His crime: touching the Queen before she became the Queen, loving her when she was still Catherine Howard, just a girl in her uncle's household. But what twisted the knife deeper was the accusation that he had used that knowledge to blackmail her to leverage his past affection into present power. In the eyes of the Crown, this was no mere scandal. It was a violation of the sacred order, a challenge to royal masculinity, and worst of all, a reminder that the king wasn't Catherine's first. The courtroom was packed, but no one came to hear evidence. They came to watch a man be erased. Witnesses lined up, letters were produced, and every trace of Francis's love was turned against him. Pet names and handwriting, once cherished, now sounded like daggers. The jury hand-picked, the outcome guaranteed. There would be no mercy, no nuance, no redemption arc. Just a sentence tailored not only to punish, but to humiliate. King Henry personally demanded that Dereham receive the full traitor's execution: dragging, hanging, castration, disembowelment, beheading, and quartering. It was a death not designed for the body, but for the soul, to make a man suffer in public, until even his memory recoiled in shame. By the end, Francis Dereham was no longer a lover or a secretary or even a man. He was an example, a warning, a name to be spit from the mouths of courtiers and erased from history books. But what Henry didn't realize is this: when you kill someone that brutally, the world remembers not the king's justice, but the victim's agony, and that memory outlives even the sharpest axe. December 10th, 1541. The streets of London didn't awaken to hymns or bells. They howled with anticipation. Merchants closed their shops. Nobles crowded balconies. Over 3,000 people swarmed the route to Tyburn, not for justice, but for spectacle. The king had promised something unforgettable, and Henry VIII never disappointed when it came to punishment. What unfolded that morning wasn't an execution. It was a performance, a slow, brutal ceremony crafted to destroy not just Francis Dereham's body, but his soul, his dignity, and his memory. Dragged from the Tower of London before sunrise, Francis was bound to a wooden hurdle, his body tied like cargo, his face scraping the frozen cobblestones with every jolt of the horses pulling him. He wore nothing but sackcloth. Mud and insults rained down from the crowd. His crime, daring to love a queen before she was a queen. But his punishment was designed for traitors of the highest order. And this would be the most savage display of royal vengeance the Tudors had ever staged. At Tyburn, a gallows had been specially constructed, taller, broader, and more visible than usual. The chief executioner, Thomas Turles, had been given one chilling instruction: make it last. First came the partial hanging. Francis was hoisted by the neck until he choked his legs, kicking violently, eyes bulging from his skull, then dropped back down before death could claim him. Not once, but 3 times. The crowd jeered, laughed, some even fainted. Then came the real horror. Still conscious, Francis was laid on a table. With a heated blade, the executioner castrated him slowly, deliberately. His screams echoed like sirens across the square. And they didn't stop there. A red-hot iron seared the wound, not out of mercy, but to keep him alive, because the king wasn't done yet. Next, they opened his abdomen. One organ at a time, they pulled him apart, saving the heart for last, holding it aloft before the man's fading eyes, until there was nothing left but agony and silence. Only then was he beheaded. Only then was he quartered. His head mounted on a pike, his limbs scattered across city gates like macabre trophies. What remained of Francis Dereham was not a body, it was a message, a warning written in blood and entrails. Do not touch what belongs to the crown. When the crowd at Tyburn finally dispersed their boots, tracking blood across the slush-covered streets of London, Francis Dereham was gone, but the shadow of what they had witnessed lingered. His execution was more than a punishment. It was a message carved into the city's collective memory, with fire and steel. And yet the story didn't end with his dismembered body, because one figure still loomed behind the screams and the spectacle, the girl he once loved. Now Queen Catherine Howard, who had watched her past turn into a death sentence. The axe hadn't touched her yet, but it was coming, and she knew it. In the cold weeks that followed, Catherine lived not as a queen, but as a prisoner inside her own palace. She was stripped of her titles, her jewelry, her dignity. The same court that had once worshipped her beauty now averted their gaze. Servants whispered. Courtiers disappeared. She was utterly alone. The king, once besotted by her youth and charm, now refused to even speak her name. She wasn't a wife anymore. She was a stain, and worse, a threat to the royal bloodline. By February of 1542, Catherine was escorted to the Tower of London, the same path Anne Boleyn had taken just 6 years earlier. But unlike Francis, whose death had been drawn out with theatrical cruelty, Catherine was granted a mercy reserved for royalty, a swift beheading. No ropes, no fire, no public flaying. Just a silent scaffold, a hooded executioner, and a young woman barely 20, trembling in the early morning fog. They say she practiced placing her head on the block the night before. They say her final words were a prayer for forgiveness. But history rarely tells us what she truly felt. Fear, shame, regret. Or perhaps something far more tragic, the realization that in the Game of Thrones, a woman's love is always more punishable than a man's ambition. Francis died in agony. Catherine died in silence. But both were casualties of the same brutal system, one that turned desire into treason and youth into a crime. And while their bodies were buried and forgotten, their story has never stopped bleeding through the cracks of England's past. Because when you love in a kingdom built on fear, you don't just risk heartbreak. You risk obliteration. There is no statue of Francis Dereham. No plaque marks the ground where his body was torn apart. His name doesn't echo through royal halls, and most history books barely spare him a sentence. And yet his story is unforgettable because it reminds us how easily love can be crushed under the boot of power. In 1541, he died screaming in a muddy square, his body broken not because he betrayed his country, but because he touched the wrong woman at the wrong time. A queen's past became a political crime, and a young man's heart became a target. That is his legacy, not as a traitor, but as a man erased to preserve a lie. What Francis suffered wasn't justice. It was image control, royal branding. Henry VIII wasn't protecting England, he was protecting himself, his pride, his masculinity, his illusion of absolute control. And in doing so, he committed one of the most horrifying acts of cruelty ever sanctioned by a European monarch. Even ambassadors at the time wrote home in horror, comparing the king's rage to the bloodlust of Rome's worst emperors. The world watched not in awe, but in disgust. And centuries later, that disgust still lingers. But this isn't just about one man in the 16th century. It's about every system that silences truth to preserve image. It's about every person who's punished not for what they did, but for who they embarrassed. And it's a warning when power goes unchecked, when pride is worshipped more than justice. Even the smallest defiance, like loving the wrong person, can cost you everything. For modern audiences especially, American viewers raised on the promise of fairness and freedom, the lesson is chillingly clear: never underestimate what people in power will do to protect their illusion of perfection. When truth becomes inconvenient, it becomes disposable. When love threatens authority, it becomes treason. Francis Dereham's name may have been scrubbed from the monuments of history, but his story survives as a quiet rebellion. A reminder that even in the darkest corners of tyranny, someone dared to love honestly and paid the ultimate price. His life may have ended in pieces, but his story speaks in one powerful voice. Power can break your body, but it cannot silence your truth. If this story shocked you, moved you, or made you see history in a whole new light, don't scroll away just yet. Drop a comment below and tell us what part hit you the hardest. Was it the love, the betrayal, or the brutal punishment? Save this video so you can revisit the full story later, and if you want more true tales of power, passion, and punishment, hit that subscribe button. We've got more dark history coming that they never taught you in school, and trust me, you won't want to miss what's next.